Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. In the autumn of 1887, along the wind-swept reaches of the Judith Basin in central Montana Territory, a peculiar structure began to rise against the endless sky. The land there stretched flat and golden toward the Little Belt Mountains, interrupted only by coulees carved deep by ancient waters and the occasional cottonwood grove hugging seasonal creeks. It was cattle country, open range where men measured wealth in head of stock and judged character by the straightness of a fence line. And it was precisely there, about 14 miles southeast of the small settlement that would later become Lewistown, that a man named Clovis Renard began building what his neighbors would come to call the Fool's Cabin. The Judith Basin in those years was experiencing its first true wave of permanent settlement. The buffalo were gone, the Métis hunters had drifted north, and the great cattle outfits from Texas and Oregon were pushing their herds onto the rich grasslands. Homesteaders followed, drawn by reports of mild winters and fertile soil, promises that would prove only partially true. Among these arrivals was Clovis Renard, a French-Canadian whose previous decades remained deliberately obscure. What records survive, a land patent filed in 1886, a bill of sale for lumber dated March of 1887, suggest a man approaching his fifth decade, unmarried, possessed of modest capital and considerable wariness. Renard had selected his quarter section with what seemed to his neighbors an inexplicable perversity. Rather than claiming land along Arrow Creek where water was reliable, he had filed on an exposed bench that caught every wind crossing the basin. The parcel sat at approximately 3,800 feet of elevation, higher than surrounding ranches by nearly 200 feet. In summer, this meant nothing. In winter, as would become terribly clear, it meant everything. The first indication that Renard intended something unusual came in April of 1887, when he began excavating. Neighbors passing on the wagon road watched with mounting puzzlement as the French-Canadian dug not a shallow foundation typical of frontier construction, but a proper cellar measuring 20 feet by 16 feet, descending a full 7 feet into the hard prairie earth. Renard worked alone through April and May, hauling dirt by wheelbarrow, shoring walls with rough-cut timber from the sawmill at Yogo Creek, some 23 miles distant. Orenthal Suggs, whose ranch lay 4 miles northeast along Arrow Creek, was among the first to comment publicly. According to a letter Suggs wrote to his brother in Nebraska, preserved among family papers and donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1952, the French-Canadian was digging clear to China for no purpose any sensible man can determine. Though Suggs estimated Renard had moved over 800 cubic feet of earth by hand, labor that could have been applied to fencing or well digging. The mockery had begun. By June, Renard had completed his excavation and begun raising walls. Here again, his methods diverged sharply from local practice. The standard construction in the Judith Basin employed a single thickness of rough-cut boards, often with canvas or tar paper applied for wind resistance. Renard, however, constructed double walls, an interior frame of 2x4 studs, an exterior frame of similar dimension, with a gap of approximately 4 inches between them. Into this gap he packed a mixture of sawdust, lime, and dried grass chopped exceedingly fine. The cost was considerable. Freight records from the Yogo Creek sawmill, examined by historian Gerald Pemberton during research in 1961, show that Renard purchased nearly double the lumber required for a conventional structure. His final cabin measured 18 feet by 14 feet on the interior, modest by any standard, yet consumed material sufficient for a building twice that size. The neighbors' ridicule intensified. Jasper Mossbank, a Texas drover who had established a small ranch 3 miles south, reportedly dubbed the rising structure Renard's Folly during a gathering at the Maiden Saloon. The name spread quickly, but the walls were merely the beginning. The roof, constructed in August, employed a pitch of nearly 45 degrees, far steeper than the shallow shed roofs common to frontier buildings. Renard covered this steep roof with overlapping cedar shakes, then applied a second layer above the first with a gap of approximately 2 inches between layers. Snow that might accumulate dangerously on a shallow roof would instead slide freely from Renard's steep pitch, while the gap between shake layers provided crucial insulating airspace. The chimney attracted particular attention. Most frontier cabins made do with a simple stovepipe, vented through the roof. Cheap, quick, and prone to failure. Renard instead constructed a proper masonry chimney from local stone, walls 8 inches thick at the base, tapering to 6 inches at the cap. Around the chimney's base, within the cabin's interior, Renard built a curious stone platform measuring 4 feet by 3 feet, raised 6 inches above the floor. The stones he gathered personally from a creek bed, selecting only those worn smooth by water and free of visible fractures. Throughout summer and into autumn, the mockery continued. Orenthal Suggs, visiting the site in September, allegedly told Renard to his face that he had built a monument to foolishness and predicted the French-Canadian would be bankrupt by spring. Jasper Mossbank, encountering Renard at the general store in Maiden, offered unsolicited advice that a man of his years should leave engineering to engineers. These exchanges were later recorded in the Fergus County Oral History Project conducted by the Works Progress Administration in 1938. What neighbors did not observe, because Renard conducted this work in solitude, was the extensive preparation occurring within and around the completed structure. The cellar beneath the cabin was divided into 3 sections, one for root vegetables and provisions, one for cordwood, and one for water storage. Into the water storage section, Renard installed 3 oak barrels of 50-gallon capacity each. He filled these barrels in October, just before the first freeze, understanding what few settlers in the basin yet grasped, that winter in this exposed location could seal a man away from any water source for weeks. The cordwood section received particular attention. Rather than simply stacking split logs, Renard arranged his supply in a specific pattern. Kindling nearest the cellar stairs, progressively larger pieces toward the back, with the heaviest logs forming the final reserve. The total supply, estimated from dimensions recorded in Renard's surviving notebook, a small leather-bound volume discovered among his effects, amounted to approximately 8 cords. This was 3 to 4 times what most settlers considered adequate for a Montana winter. The notebook itself offers remarkable insight into Renard's preparations. Written in a cramped hand mixing French and English, with numerous abbreviations, the notebook documents purchases, measurements, and observations spanning from March 1887 to February 1888. An entry dated September 12th reads, "Wind from northwest 3 days now, grass lying flat. Same before hard winter in Quebec, 1869. Another entry from October 3rd observes, "Suggs moving cattle to low ground. Does not understand the coolies will drift shut. I remember." These cryptic references suggest Renard had survived severe winters elsewhere, experiences that informed his apparently excessive preparations. By end of October, the cabin stood complete. The double walls had been sealed at every joint. The windows, 2 only, one facing south and one facing east, were fitted with interior shutters of solid pine, hinged to swing closed and bar from within. The door was constructed of 2 layers of oak planking with grain running perpendicular, creating a panel nearly 3 inches thick. The threshold was raised 4 inches above exterior grade, a detail that seemed merely peculiar until one understood its purpose in preventing snow infiltration. The neighbors' mockery reached its peak during a gathering at the Mossbank Ranch in early November. The occasion was a collective cattle count, a social event, bringing together most of the basin's settlers. Renard attended briefly, departing before the evening meal. During his presence, according to accounts preserved in the WPA materials, he endured sustained ridicule. Jasper Mossbank produced a rough sketch he had made of the cabin and passed it among assembled ranchers, inviting comparison to a prairie fortress. Orenthal Suggs suggested the double walls concealed illicit goods. Renard responded to this mockery with characteristic opacity. He neither defended his methods nor explained his reasoning. When pressed directly regarding the cellar's depth and excessive cordwood supply, Renard reportedly replied only that he preferred to be prepared. This laconic response satisfied no one. Several attendees later recalled that Renard departed with what they interpreted as a knowing expression, though they could not agree whether this reflected smugness, resignation, or simple indifference. The first significant snowfall arrived on November 19, 1887, earlier than average. 8 inches accumulated overnight, driven by winds that piled drifts against every south-facing structure. For most settlers, this initial storm posed no particular hardship. The snow was dry, temperatures moderate, cattle still on accessible range. But the snow did not melt. Temperatures remained consistently below freezing, preserving the accumulation. A second storm on November 26th added another 6 inches. A third on December 4th contributed nearly a foot. By mid-December, the Judith Basin lay under an unbroken white expanse, averaging 2 feet in depth, with drifts reaching 6 feet or more. Christmas of 1887 brought brief respite. Temperatures rose above freezing for 3 consecutive days, and settlers took advantage to check on neighbors and retrieve mail. Several ranchers observed Renard's cabin under winter conditions. What they saw surprised them. The cabin stood clear of drifting. The steep roof had shed its snow load completely. The double walls showed no visible frost penetration. Renard himself appeared well provisioned in a way that contrasted with the strained circumstances of neighbors already rationing firewood. But the Christmas thaw proved a cruel illusion. On December 28, 1887, the temperature began falling. It continued falling for the next 16 days. The phenomenon that descended upon Montana Territory in early January 1888 would later be documented extensively. The cold wave between January 5th and January 20th remains among the most severe in recorded American history. At Fort Assiniboine, military observers recorded temperatures of minus 46 degrees Fahrenheit. At Helena, mercury thermometers proved useless, the liquid contracting below the scale's lower limit. The Judith Basin, exposed and elevated, experienced conditions at least as severe. At temperatures below minus 30 degrees, familiar materials behave in unfamiliar ways. Wood contracts and splits. Metal becomes brittle. Kerosene thickens until it will not draw through a lamp wick. Water freezes in buckets placed beside stoves. And everywhere, the cold seeks entry. Through cracks, through chinking, through single-wall construction designed for more moderate climates. The first casualty was the cattle. Across the northern ranges, herds began dying in catastrophic numbers. The snow prevented foraging. The cold sapped their reserves. Cattle drifted with the wind, piling against fence lines and into coulees, where they froze by the thousands. Estimates of mortality across Montana Territory range from 60 to 90% of the total herd. The great ranching empires collapsed virtually overnight. But the human toll was no less devastating. A cowhand from the Suggs Ranch arrived at Maiden on January 8th, having traveled 14 hours through brutal conditions. The supplies at the Suggs Ranch, he reported, were nearly exhausted. The firewood supply had proven grossly inadequate. The single-wall construction allowed frost to form on interior walls, and the occupants were burning furniture to maintain any warmth. A relief party organized in Maiden on January 9th attempted to reach the Suggs Ranch. They turned back after 3 miles, defeated by wind-driven snow and temperatures threatening immediate injury. For the next 11 days, the Judith Basin remained effectively sealed. No one traveled. No one communicated. Each household became an isolated island in a frozen sea. At the Mossbank Ranch, conditions grew desperate by January 12th. Jasper Mossbank's journal, preserved by descendants, documents the progressive collapse. January 10th, wood nearly gone. Burned corral rails yesterday. Today starting on barn timbers. January 12th, cannot feel hands properly. Writing difficult. January 14th, slaughtered cattle outside the door, using bones and hides for fuel. Grease smoke fills the house. January 16th, no entry possible. Jaw. It was on January 17th, during a brief period of diminished wind, that Orenthal Suggs made a decision born of desperation. He would attempt to reach the nearest neighbor for assistance. That neighbor was Clovis Renard. The journey of 4 miles through waist-deep snow should have been fatal. Suggs later estimated it required nearly 6 hours. He walked, crawled, and at times simply lay in the snow, waiting for strength to continue. His beard accumulated ice from his breath that partially froze his mouth shut. What Suggs found when he finally reached Renard's cabin would become the central image of the winter's local folklore. The cabin stood intact, undrifted, chimney-producing steady smoke. When Suggs pounded on the door, it opened promptly, revealing an interior that seemed to his frost-dazzled perception impossibly warm. Renard pulled him inside without a word. The cabin's interior temperature, maintained by the stone platform that absorbed heat from the chimney and radiated it throughout the night, hovered near 50 degrees, uncomfortable by normal standards, luxurious beyond measure compared to the conditions Suggs had fled. The water barrels in the cellar remained unfrozen. The cordwood supply had barely been touched. Renard had been living, if not comfortably, then at least sustainably throughout the ordeal. For 3 days, Suggs remained at the cabin, recovering strength, while the cold continued. During this time, Renard revealed little about himself or his methods. He answered direct questions with brief, factual responses. Yes, he had experienced severe winters before. Yes, he had built accordingly. No, he took no particular satisfaction in his neighbor's difficulties. The preparations had been made for his own survival, not to prove any point. On January 20th, the weather finally broke. Temperatures rose into the single digits, still brutally cold, but survivable. Renard accompanied Suggs back to the Suggs Ranch, traveling on improvised snowshoes constructed from willow branches and rawhide. What they found there was grim, but not catastrophic. The occupants had survived, though barely. The ranch house was nearly destroyed, its interior structural timbers having been fed to the stove during the final desperate days. The Mossbank Ranch had fared similarly. Jasper Mossbank and his wife emerged from their ordeal weakened but alive. Their livestock, like nearly everyone's in the basin, had been devastated. The corral was empty. The barn was a skeleton, its boards consumed for fuel. When full accounting became possible in late February, the scale of the disaster emerged. Of the estimated 90,000 cattle grazing Montana Territory, ranges before the winter, fewer than 20,000 survived. Dozens of ranching operations declared bankruptcy. The era of open-range cattle ranching in Montana, which had seemed so permanent just months before, was effectively ended. Among the survivors, attitudes toward Clovis Renard underwent a notable transformation. The man who had been mocked as a fool was now sought for advice. Settlers rebuilding their destroyed homes came to examine his construction methods. They measured his wall thickness, studied his roof pitch, examined his cellar design. The techniques that had seemed excessive were revealed as precisely calibrated to the challenges of the environment. Challenges that others had underestimated or simply refused to acknowledge. Renard himself remained characteristically reticent about his vindication. He continued operating his small homestead through the following years, never expanding significantly, never accumulating the wealth that might have been possible in the aftermath of others' failures. Land was cheap after the great die-up. A man with capital and ambition could have assembled a substantial holding. Renard showed no interest in such opportunities. The final entry in Renard's surviving notebook, dated February 23, 1888, reads simply, "Spring will come. Memory is short. Build for what is possible, not what is probable. The probable killed 90,000 cattle. The possible is why I am alive to write this." The subsequent history of the Judith Basin reflects patterns seen across the American frontier. The catastrophe of 1887-1888 was gradually absorbed into local memory, transformed from lived experience into cautionary tale. Newcomers arrived who had not witnessed the great die-up, who heard the stories, but could not quite believe conditions had been so severe. Construction practices improved somewhat, then gradually relaxed as memories faded and economies pressured settlers toward cheaper methods. Renard lived until 1903, dying in the same cabin he had built 16 years earlier. The structure itself survived intact until 1934, when it was finally demolished by a subsequent owner who wished to construct a more modern dwelling. Before demolition, the cabin was photographed and measured by a surveyor named Horace Whitfield, whose documentation was deposited with county records in 1935. These measurements confirmed the construction details described in witness accounts: the double walls, the steep roof, the massive chimney, the deep cellar. The techniques were sound. They had simply been ahead of their time. The story of Renard's cabin entered regional folklore as a parable about preparation and pride. In the telling and retelling, details shifted and embellished. Some versions added dramatic confrontations between Renard and his mockers. Others invented romantic backstories explaining Renard's knowledge. The historical record, such as it is, supports a more modest interpretation. A man who had experienced hardship learned from it and applied those lessons practically, while those who had not experienced such hardship assumed it could not occur. The lesson of the frontier, as revealed in records examined and compiled during the historical surveys of the 1950s and 1960s, was not that caution always triumphs or that preparation guarantees survival. Many cautious, prepared people perished in that winter. Many reckless, unprepared people survived through pure chance. But the statistical pattern was clear. Those who built for the worst possibilities fared better, on average, than those who built for typical conditions. The margin between survival and catastrophe was often measured in inches of wall thickness, cords of firewood, gallons of stored water. Clovis Renard understood this margin. He built accordingly. And when the worst came, as it sometimes does, he was ready. The wind still crosses the Judith Basin in winter, sweeping down from the Little Belt Mountains and across the high benchlands where Renard once lived. The land has changed, fenced, cultivated, crossed by roads and power lines, but the wind remains the same. It carries snow that piles in coulees, drops temperatures that strain modern heating systems, tests the construction of buildings whose builders may or may not have learned from history. On the site where the Fool's Cabin once stood, there is now a modest ranch house built in the 1950s. Its walls are adequately insulated by modern standards. Its furnace burns propane delivered by truck. Its occupants, during severe winters, sometimes find themselves remembering stories told by grandparents and great-grandparents. Stories about a French-Canadian who dug too deep and built too strong, whose neighbors laughed until the laughing stopped. The laughter always stops eventually. The question is only whether wisdom arrives before or after the silence.